Hi, my name is Andrew Gunawella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today on Monday. I hope you aren't checking your retirement accounts this morning. It's about 8:30 a.m., right as we're opening up this week. But I have a very special guest joining me here today. I have Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton is a former U.S. National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the United Nations. Known for his prominent foreign policy views, he is a longtime advocate for strong U.S. global posture and has served in multiple Republican administrations, including most notably in the Trump and Bush administrations. Ambassador, thank you for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Well, glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, Ambassador Bolton, what are your general perceptions of the second Trump administration so far, and how does it compare to the first administration, which you worked for?
Well, I think we're seeing the kinds of things Trump did in the first term, but maybe even more pronounced, less related to core national security interest and more reflecting his own very strange view of the world in many respects, whether it's the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, trade, obviously, or a whole range of other international issues. And the commonality between the two is that hard as this is for many people to appreciate, Trump has no overarching philosophy. He doesn't have a national security grand strategy. He doesn't even really do policy in the way we understand things. This is all very personal to him, and as you might observe, he doesn't really have ideas about a lot of things. He has reactions, and that's the way foreign affairs plays out.
So we've heard this term transactional used quite a bit when describing the foreign policy of President Trump. I mean, how do we understand the foreign policy of President Trump? I mean, you sort of refer to it as reactionary. Can we go a little bit deeper?
No, because Trump doesn't go any deeper. When I say transactional, it's also equivalent to saying ad hoc, episodic. Um, we were told in the first Trump term that when he would go to his office at the Trump Organization on a typical day before he became president, he wouldn't make a daily schedule. He'd come in and say each morning and say, "Well, let's see what happens today." Now, maybe that's the way to be a rich real estate developer in New York, but it's not how you run the U.S. government as president of the United States. But to him, life is a sort of series of discrete decisions, deals. He loves to talk about deals. Uh, Much like a real estate broker, I assume, and I don't know the business, so I'm making my own assumptions as a home purchaser and things like that, that to a real estate developer, you buy one lot, you put a house on it, you sell it, you buy the next lot, you put a house on it. Sometimes you buy 100 lots and put 100 houses on them. But each deal is something new and different, apart from the overall incentive to make money. And in Trump's world, the overall incentive, the guiding principle, is what makes Donald Trump look better. So I said in my book that
Mhm.
in his first term, he made thousands of decisions, probably most of which I agreed with, but they're like a big archipelago of dots. You can try and connect them if you want, but he can't even connect them.
So, can we sort of extrapolate this to specifically how President Trump made national security decisions? I mean, was there ever any consistency whatsoever, or was it just personality driven?
Well, that really is the consistency, and it's very hard to run a Brent Scowcroft kind of national
Hmm.
security decision-making process when you have that kind of president, where policies are formulated interagency, the options are presented to the president, he makes a decision, and then you make sure that the decision is implemented. With Trump, it was much more ad hoc, often depended on the last person who spoke to him, and things could change literally from morning to afternoon. So I think those of us who served in the first Trump term did a lot of work just to kind of keep the train moving down the tracks, and unfortunately did not nearly as much as advisors to the president should do, which is try and forecast what's coming, to predict what crisis or opportunity is next, and do at least a little bit of advanced thinking. So you put the president in a better decision. We were playing catch up far too much, and I see that really doubled down on in the second term.
Absolutely, and we're going to get to the second term in a little bit. But in terms of the people he listened to, you referred to sort of the last person in the room would maybe have the greatest influence. But did you observe any patterns in the types of advisors that President Trump would listen to, and more importantly, perhaps ignored when making some of these key foreign policy decisions?
Well, I think as former Attorney General Bill Barr once said to me, you have to assume in a Trump presidency that you have a life expectancy where you're going to serve for a while and then leave. Nobody really thought in 4-year terms. There were a few people who made it for 4 years, but that in and of itself, I think, is a sign of chaos in decision making, that the president was unable to decide on exactly what he wanted in a given position. Uh, Rudy Giuliani was asked during the
Hmm.
2016 campaign. Reporter said, "Did does how much does Trump listen to you?" And Giuliani paused and thought for a moment and said, "About 20% of the time," which we all thought was a pretty good batting average.
Not bad. I mean, when we're talking about President Trump, I mean, how does he compare in terms of decision making to President Bush? You worked with President George W. Bush quite intensely, during the 2000s. And I've heard many things about how he would sort of ask a lot of questions during those PDBs, sort of listen very intently. How did President Bush make decisions, and so on? How did he consider them?
Well, I think obviously each president has his own style, and that's a given in politics. They're not all the same. Some are very, very orderly.
Hmm.
Dwight Eisenhower is kind of the paradigm of that in the post-World War II period. George H.W. Bush, because of his enormous experience in foreign policy, was likewise very organized. And George W. Bush, had as coming as governor of Texas to the presidency, even though he was obviously his father's son and knew about a lot from that experience. Also understood that to make the best kinds of decisions in national security, you need to learn a lot as president. No president comes into the White House with 360-degree knowledge of all of his responsibilities. Some are better on the international side, some are better on the domestic side. But wherever your experience is not what it might be. A good president appreciates that and learns facts, learns people, learns options, learns a whole lot. And George W. Bush, as you say, never tired of asking questions.
Hmm.
And for those who are trying to advise him, that's important because it tells you what's on the president's mind, and it tells you what kinds of information he wants and how he likes his options presented. Trump's questions tend to be random and not following any particular line. And indeed, during his intelligence briefings, he spent, in some cases, most of the time talking, forgetting about the old Lyndon Johnson comment who once said, I don't learn very much when I'm talking. Trump never understood that.
I mean, I was a child during the Bush administration, but I feel sort of reading back on history, reading back on certain books, that there's this idea that I think perhaps President Bush sort of grew and matured during his presidency over 8 years in terms of how he conducted decisions, in terms of how he thought through things. I'm not so sure if I'm seeing that certainly with President Trump, at least during the first term. Is that accurate? Because I mean, you work with both pretty significantly. You've known President Bush for a little bit. Is that sort of accurate to an extent?
Well, I think so. Remember, after 9/11, he was a wartime president, and
Hmm.
that will age anybody,
Yeah.
and B, impress on them if they didn't get it before, how serious are the issues that they confront as president, and the gravity of the responsibility and the potential reach of the consequences of what may seem to be even kind of small decisions that a president has to make. George H.W. Bush understood that almost from the beginning. I think Ronald Reagan came to understand it very quickly. And I just don't think Trump was ever disciplined by the gravity of the job that he held. And it made it very hard to get him to focus on consequences and to move off ideas that he might pick up when some guest at Mar-a-Lago made a suggestion to him that he adopted as his own.
So speaking of people who make suggestions that President Trump then adopts, last week we saw, I think, several high-profile National Security Council firings. Reports said that President Trump had met with far-right activist Laura Loomer regarding that, and that she may have suggested to him to fire those individuals. What do you make of those recent firings? Because, I mean, these were some pretty legitimate people he fired from the NSC.
Yeah, I think it shows. Let me start a different kind of answer. I
Sure.
feel Mike Waltz is in a very difficult position, and so I empathize with him. But what these firings show is how tenuous his position is at the moment. If as national security advisor I couldn't hire and keep the people I thought could do the job, then I think if I had come to that, I would have resigned because. That's the sort of thing that the president has to have faith that you know what you're doing. The problem in Trump too is that he doesn't want to hear a lot of different opinions. And I'm not saying he doesn't want to hear liberal opinions or conservative. He just doesn't want to hear other opinions. And we got a taste of that in the first term. For example, when we were in Brussels for the 2018 NATO summit, and Mike Pompeo and I were in a room with Trump before going to the summit, trying to persuade him not to withdraw from NATO. And I had been in the job about 2 months, and at some point, Trump looked at Pompeo and said, I knew I should have picked Keith Kellogg to be National Security Advisor. Keith only gives me his opinion when I ask for it. Now, the title of the job is National Security Advisor, which kind of implies you give
Advisor.
advice. But Trump doesn't want advice. He wants affirmation of whatever he's got in his head at any given moment. That doesn't really serve the president well. But although Trump doesn't understand that, it certainly doesn't serve America well.
So, Ambassador, I mean, right as we actually cap this interview off, we're about to see perhaps some of the big repercussions of one of President Trump's major decisions as soon as the stock market opens. The tariffs, I mean, that's been on everyone's mind. I mean, I was sort of dominated all last week in terms of work, my day job, sort of analyzing what do the tariffs mean. I mean, what are your reactions to the president's strategy or lack thereof, a strategy on this sort of tariffs on the world and his broader sort of trade maneuvers?
Well, I think the whole thing is a kind of economic madness. There are obviously imperfections in the international trading system. Uh, but these have come to be negotiated, at least with our friends and allies, over decades. Trump complains about the trading relationship between the U.S. and on the one hand, Canada and Mexico on the other. Well, he's the one who negotiated the revision to NAFTA that we know as the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement in 2018, 2019. If he is dissatisfied with that, he ought to find the idiot who negotiated it and fire him. Because it was one of his prize achievements in his first term. And now, 5, 6 years later, he's just throwing it away again. Trump has very primitive ideas about economics, but because it involves dollars and cents, he thinks he really has a grasp of it. So he talks about how bad trade deficits are. Well, trade deficits country to country are neither inherently bad nor inherently good, any more than we care about the trade deficit between North Carolina and South Carolina. That's free trade, which is a policy the United States adopted after World War II to spur economic growth worldwide, and which by and large succeeded, is not something that's measured by the country to country trade surplus or trade deficit. There are national security issues that are important in trade. China is a major bad actor across the board in international trade. These are issues to talk about, but they
Hmm.
have nothing to do with the tariffs that Trump has put in place. Nothing.
I mean, when we go back to the Nixon administration, some people have coined this theory called the madman theory, right, around like foreign policy. And some may want to apply that to how President Trump is sort of governing foreign policy, particularly with this tariff situation, particularly with what he's willing to do. Do you believe that may apply at all, or do you think otherwise?
No, it doesn't. Nixon knew Nixon knew exactly what he was doing, and the particular scenario when it came up was how to deal with China on a certain question. And Nixon said to Kissinger, "Look, you tell him this guy Nixon. There's no telling what he might do. He might use nuclear weapons." And it was a valid threat to make because the Chinese knew that Nixon had made his entire political career on the basis of being a hardline anti-communist. And so a nuclear threat from Nixon, which may sound mad to many people, would have credibility. Trump has no philosophy. He's just erratic and in some cases unstable in his approach. I don't think that frightens other people. I think it says to them, look, this may be a rough ride here. We better be ready for it. I think that's the reaction, frankly, you're seeing from China right now to the Trump tariffs. They're not rushing to negotiate. They're gonna fight back as they have started, and maybe will continue. Could be a long struggle with China over this.
I mean, speaking of China, I mean, what's your take on President Trump's Indo-Pacific slash China strategy? I mean, are we seeing at least general continuity on that foreign policy front from the Biden administration or even the first Trump administration?
Well, in the first Trump term, he went back and forth because there were times when he saw the risk that China posed really all along its Indo-Pacific periphery. There were other times when he wanted to make the biggest trade deal in history, as he liked to call
Hmm.
it, to try and curtail some of China's offensive economic practices internationally, stealing intellectual property and the like. But there was never a coherent pattern. When he came into the second term, uh, during the 2024 campaign, he was very critical of China, largely because he blames China for him losing the 2020 election because of COVID. Not that he's saying they intentionally inflicted COVID on the world, but it obviously came from China and disrupted the world's economies, particularly the U.S., where we were doing pretty well, and Trump could have reasonably expected that good
Yeah.
economic performance would have gotten him reelected. But I will tell you, at the moment that Xi Jinping calls him up, which could happen at any point, and says, "Look, why don't the two of us sit down? We can work this out." Uh, Trump will jump at the opportunity. He'll be on a plane to Beijing because he thinks that U.S.-China relations, like U.S.-Russia relations, really depend on the personal relationship of the two leaders. And he thinks he and Xi Jinping are friends, thinks he's friends with Putin too.
How do you believe the Chinese government is actually perceiving sort of this approach? Because I mean, there's been a lot of like noise about like, will they, won't they meet? Will Trump meet Xi? When will they meet? Where will they meet? How will the meeting actually go about? Like, will it occur in DC or Beijing? How do you believe the PRC is actually viewing Trump's sort of personality-driven approach?
Well, I think they don't know what to make of it. I think they see it as even more personality driven than it was in the first term. I had thought it would be to China's advantage to engage with Trump very quickly, to try and reestablish the personal relationship, at least in Trump's mind. Obviously, that's not the course China has pursued, and my my guess is that it's because they think he's too hard to predict. They don't want to move one way or the other. And now that reticence, I think, is paying off for them because it was Trump that made the first move by launching the trade war, by putting the 34% tariffs on China. And now China can respond and take advantage of the enormous opportunity that Trump has given them to go to everybody else in the world and say, look, the United States is sort of fallen off the edge of a cliff here. Deal with us. We're a stable country. You can have stable trade relations with us. I think it's a very powerful argument, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean those 34% tariffs we just put on China, I mean stack on top of I believe the 20% existing that we've already put on. And I mean we're all watching to see, when will these trade negotiations happen? Do you believe that successful like trade negotiations between the US and China actually really depend on whether like Trump actually meets Xi? Like can they not handle this at a ministerial level, for example?
No, Trump wants the credit one way or the other when the deal is cut. The problem is that the tariffs serve different objectives for Trump that are completely contradictory. So, for example, he wants high enough tariffs so that manufacturing will return to the United States. Now, you can argue whether that's a good thing under the theory of competitive advantage, which has worked for at least the last 200 years that we understood it. You don't have to produce everything in the United States. But that if under that theory, it requires a high enough level of tariffs that domestic investors or foreign investors will put money into a sector that's tariffed because they're behind a protective wall. So reducing the tariff wall, making a deal, lessens your ability to achieve the result that's purportedly the rationale for the tariffs to begin with. Likewise, on taxation, Trump argues that the foreigners, he says, are paying us billions of dollars already. Well, A, they're not, because the foreigners don't pay the tariffs. American importers pay the tariffs and then try and pass it to the consumers. But B, all this revenue that's supposedly flowing into the U.S. Treasury would be reduced if you lower the tariff rate. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like any question of what's the effective rate of taxation, and what's the optimal rate to get the most revenue between 0% tariff where you get no revenue and 1,000,000% tariff where you get no revenue because nobody ships products at that rate. These tariffs were based on a formula having nothing to do with trying to optimize the revenue. It's the same formula for every country, based entirely on the trade deficit with the country, which is based on a non-problem. So when you look for the reasoning and the strategy and the implications of what Trump has done on tariffs, it doesn't take too long before you realize there isn't anything. He just thinks, as he said repeatedly, the word tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
So now, Ambassador, moving to the war in Ukraine, U.S.-Russia relations. I mean, what do you believe is President Trump's approach to the war in Ukraine and subsequent negotiations, if any, with Russian President Vladimir Putin? We saw that notorious situation in the Oval Office where President Trump and President Zelensky got into that sparring match involving the vice president. What do you make of the approach to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Trump doesn't think this war has any purpose. He said in the State of the Union message it was senseless. Uh, that's a 180-degree shift from the Biden administration and people like myself who support aiding Ukraine. You know, the Ukrainians are fighting against an act of unprovoked aggression by the Russians, which has serious consequences well beyond Ukraine if that unprovoked aggression proves successful. And second, the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom and independence. That's not senseless. We fought for our freedom and independence once. We didn't think it was senseless. Trump wants this war behind him. He thinks it's Biden's war. He would say the same of the war in the Middle East. He said during the campaign that it never would have happened if he had been president. So he just doesn't want to bother with it, which says to me he's prepared to settle it almost on any terms. The substance doesn't matter to him. That plays directly into Vladimir Putin's hands, and Putin has been, I think, successfully manipulating Trump in the 2 months plus since the inauguration.
So, how do you perceive of the administration's, and not just Trump's, but the administration's perspective towards our European allies and NATO? I mean, why does President Trump, but also Vice President Vance and others seem to have such negative sentiments towards NATO?
It's something that is very hard to explain. Trump had again, he sees everything through the prism of personal relationships. So he had a bad relationship with Merkel, of Germany, a bad relationship with Theresa May of the UK, but he had a good relationship with Boris Johnson, and he loved being invited to a state dinner with the Queen. So, if Europeans that still have monarchies were to follow Keir Starmer's example and invite Trump to a state dinner in Britain with King Charles or whatever other king or queen they have, that's a road to better relations. It doesn't follow that he just doesn't like Europeans. It's not like saying he doesn't like Africans. He likes some people that he meets with and others that he doesn't. The basic problem is on NATO is that Trump doesn't understand how NATO works. He basically he thinks we defend Europe, we don't get anything out of it, and they don't pay. Well, if I thought that's the way NATO worked, I probably wouldn't be in favor of it either. But he doesn't appreciate that NATO having allies, whether an alliance like that or bilateral, like with Japan and South Korea, brings the United States enormous benefits. To him, again, everything is dollars and cents, and he finds it hard to rise above that.
I mean, I think we saw some hints, though, in the Signal chat, the transcripts around how some of the cabinet officials feel about NATO, feel about our European allies. Why do you believe that some of these cabinet officials, for example, the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, also have such strong negative sentiments towards NATO? Like, what about Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for example?
Yeah. Well, I think they're parroting the boss. I mean, I think that's that kind of fealty, that kind of subservience they think is good for job security. And they're probably right about that. I think as a whole, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that political leaders in the United States have not adequately addressed questions of what do we need to do in the world to keep us safe. The end of communism, the end of history, as
Yeah.
people said at the time, led people to believe you could cut defense budgets without consequence. They called it the peace dividend. And people political leaders just stopped talking to American voters in the ways that the Eisenhowers and Reagans of the post-World War II era did to explain what we had to do to keep ourselves safe. And we're paying for that now. Rubio is a strong supporter of NATO. He was in Congress, so was Mike Waltz. On Rubio's just concluded trip to a NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, he was very robust in his support for NATO. That's not where Trump is.
So, this issue of Greenland, what do you make of President Trump's repeatedly expressed desire to acquire Greenland? Are there any national security implications around the Greenland issue?
Yeah, well, this started in 2019. I had the NSC staff research it in depth. I'm happy to tell you almost anything you need to know about Greenland, at least as much as I still remember. There are considerable national security interests for the United States and the whole NATO alliance in Greenland. There were during the Cold War when we had not just the Thule Air Force Base, which is still there under a different name. At one point, we had 16 military bases in Greenland during the Cold War, worried about what the Soviets were doing across the polar ice cap, ranging from ballistic missiles to nuclear submarines. All of those concerns obviously have changed since the end of the Cold War, but they're increasing again, not just because of the threat of Russia in the maritime domain as the polar ice cap shrinks, but the Chinese as well, who would love to be able to come up through the Bering Straits and end up in the North Atlantic, passing near between Greenland and Iceland. So, and then you add the mineral assets that Greenland and other far north territories hold that with the ice melting suddenly become exploitable. You're in a different generation, but still with an enormous strategic interest in Greenland. And this is nothing new for the United States. Donald Trump did not invent or discover Greenland. In 1868, William Seward, fresh from buying Alaska from the Russians, tried to buy Greenland from Denmark. And it's not clear whether he made a deal that the Senate never got around to ratifying or he couldn't make a deal. But that's how far back it goes in recognition that Greenland, which is part of the North Atlantic, part of the North American landmass, not the European landmass, really is of interest to the U.S. Now, that doesn't mean we need sovereignty over it. I wouldn't
Yeah.
be opposed to that. I wouldn't be opposed if the Greenlanders wanted to become a Commonwealth. I think that'd be fine. But the issue here is not sovereignty. The issue is security. And if we could take this out of the spotlights, negotiate it behind closed doors with the Greenlanders and Denmark, I think we could come to a resolution. I think we could have come to a resolution in 2019 if Trump had just stopped talking about it.
Yeah, but I mean, this idea of the notion of sovereignty, which is what I believe is really dominating the media discourse around the Greenland issue, right? Like the idea of the United States annexing Greenland that President Trump seems to keep alluding to. I mean, can't we accomplish the same national security goals without actually getting Greenland, without actually owning Greenland? Because that sounds a little bit imperialist.
Well, that wouldn't bother me particularly, but I do think that you have to focus on what the real objective is, and the real objective is security. There are a lot of different ways that this could be approached, but then my staff at the NSC studied all this back in 2019. I mean, one is to look at this very famous treaty that nobody's ever heard of, the 1951 Defense of Greenland Treaty, a bilateral treaty between Denmark and the United States. It really opens the possibility for pretty much everything I think we are interested in. It could be updated and revised. There are a lot of things there that could be made to work to the satisfaction of all the parties. We're in a different time, but remember, this is the last effort to buy Greenland was Harry Truman in 1947 offered the Danes 100 million and they wouldn't take it. He should have offered them 250 million. Maybe we wouldn't be worried about this today. But for Trump, it's just too hard to think about other ways of doing it. He thinks sovereignty, and that's as far as it goes.
And I wish we had a full hour to discuss the Greenland research you did at the NSC because that'd be a fascinating conversation. I feel like I'd love to ask more on that topic and interrogate more, but we're running out of time. But Ambassador Bolton, my last question, how do you believe that the Republican Party has changed between the Bush administration and the Trump administration? Perhaps in extending this question, not just to the second Bush administration, but even back to the Reagan administration, which you worked for. How has it changed and why?
Well, I think Trump has had a significant influence on it, but I think many people are intimidated by Trump. I think it's the natural tendency of people to support what the leader of their party says. But I think out in the country, it's still a Reagan party. It's still a peace through strength party as Reagan understood it. And when Trump leaves the political scene, I think it will snap back. I think that
Really?
that this tariff episode may be what brings people to their senses. That, having these high tariffs is what the American labor union movement wanted for many years. It's what the extreme left wanted in the 80s and the 90s to stop globalization. There are issues in international trade. There's no question about it. Sometimes serious issues, particularly affecting national security. But you don't deal with those very real issues with this kind of tariff approach. This is a wealth destroying, potentially catastrophic economic policy that Trump doesn't fully understand.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for your time. For our audience, if you want to learn more about Ambassador Bolton's time in the Trump administration, you can get his book, The Room Where It Happened. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go check my stock portfolio right now. I'm a little concerned.
Well, glad to be with you. Thanks again.
Thank you.